All right, here we are back at the Business Roundtable with returning guests. We may have even some surprise guests coming and joining us here later in the podcast. But due to popular demand, we're going to pick up on an episode that we had a couple episodes back where we were talking about boundaries with Bill and Charlie, and now we've got Doc C back with us. And so just to introduce, for those of you that are catching this episode or maybe watching it for the first time on YouTube or seeing a LinkedIn event, I will do a brief introductions. My name is David Carr, Steward Your Business, where I help business owners and their team come together to accomplish great things and focus on overall organizational health. We have Bil Hatch back. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
And you're another podcast extraordinaire. What are you working on now, Bill?
Well, actually, speaking of, I was going to talk about it as part of the boundaries. I've been having some boundary issues with my podcast.
Right.
So it'll be a great example for during the show. But I'm in the process of writing my book series on leadership, and I podcast under the banner of Bald Spots Productions.
We're looking forward to hearing more about the book and, of course, your recent experience on boundaries. We have Charlie Chen back with us. Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always great to be back, David. Thank you for having me back. I'm representing Spiky Hair Productions over here.
The Full Hawk.
Full Hawk Production. You're gonna have to watch the video here.
Yeah. Exactly. And then when you said good to have Bil Hatch back, I was for a second there I was thinking you were talking about Bill's favorite car, like a hatchback. So anyway, yeah. So yeah. Did you want me to introduce myself?
Just briefly, right, who you're with and your background briefly, Charlie.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, so my name is Charlie Chen. For the older folks, almost like the detective Charlie Chan, off by one letter. And I work in cybersecurity. I try to do stand-up comedy in the cybersecurity awareness trainings that I do, but it's not going very well. So, but I'm going to stick with my day job in cybersecurity.
Well, we're glad you're here.
Thank you. Yeah. So my role there at Intelisys is Chief Experience Officer, where we're committed to delivering peace of mind, all while doing it with world-class customer service and experience, so you don't have to put up with rude IT people.
There you go. And Doc C, back. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure. Curtis Cochran here. We are a mergers acquisition company, but we do more than that. We actually not only build companies financially, but within their company culture to actually prepare for an exit strategy, if indeed that comes. And it can, of course, be an exit strategy, or they acquire another business as well. So that's kind of what we do, and it kind of aligns to what our topic is today.
Absolutely. So we're going to do a little recap. So those of you that missed the episode, please go back. Episode 27, I believe. We're actually on episode 29, if you guys can believe that. We're moving right along. Pretty exciting. So I'll start with you, Charlie, and then maybe come back around with you, Bill, because Charlie was the one actually that planted the seed of this discussion of boundaries. And just briefly, we're going to get more into how we deal and how we implement them, but what just boundaries in general, Charlie, briefly, what we talked about as a recap from last episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're essential, and thanks for bringing this back, but it sounds like it's going to be by popular demand. But so boundaries are essential because they help create a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities. It prevents misunderstandings and ensures that everybody feels respected and valued in the workplace. They also protect our time, energy, and allowing us to be more productive and maintain a healthy work-life balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, just any other thoughts as we're getting in forward of just what a boundary is, why we need that, why is it vital?
Well, what a boundary is a line in the sand, if you will, between where others are and where you are, defining what's okay for people to approach you with and what's not okay. Such as last minute demands or needs, or needs that take you over your time, like if you have plans with your family to go to the ball game or something, then that's something you have to protect. You have to protect your time with your family, and so you set up a boundary. And like Charlie said, they're important for all manner of reasons, everything from work-life balance to productivity.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to get into these, and especially with Doc C here, because sometimes there are clear written boundaries, and sometimes there's boundaries that it's not so clear, or they're kind of invisible boundaries, and we're like, I didn't know I crossed a boundary, right? So this is going to get really into some practical nuts and bolts here in this episode about how you can make sure that these boundaries are, number one, as clearly established, and number two, they're implemented well, and how you deal with them when they are violated, like you said, Bill or Charlie. Curtis, any other thoughts here just on this first thought as we're getting kind of laying the groundwork here for boundaries?
Yeah, I think both Bill and Charlie hit it, and Charlie said it really. Protecting time and energy. Time and energy is what it's all about, and you kind of if you protect the time and energy, the company is going to grow even faster. So I think that both of them hit on both time and energy. I like it.
So I'll open this up as the next kind of topic then. So we've kind of got those as, okay, we're agreeing that boundaries are necessary. They're very helpful, but how do we effectively communicate these boundaries with each other? And so we're all agreeing that boundaries are good. And maybe I'll just come to you, Charlie, first, if you don't mind here. But how do we, effectively, how can leaders, whether you're a business owner or a leader, you've got people underneath you, how do you effectively make sure that the boundaries are established and understood and respected? We'll just start with you first, Charlie.
Absolutely. So first, it's crucial to recognize your own limits and communicate them clearly to your colleagues and supervisors. Oftentimes, it's hard for people to do that, especially if they're operating from toxic shame, where they believe they are less than human, so therefore they have to be more than human to prove their worth. And that's a dangerous place to be, because then you wind up putting yourself in a situation where you're overpromising and under-delivering, and that's actually gives you the adverse effect of what your intention is, which is to deliver a great experience and to actually do a good job. And so using tools like calendar blocking to manage your time effectively and ensure that you have dedicated time for breaks and personal tasks. Also, don't be afraid to say no when necessary, right? But do it respectfully and offer alternative solutions when possible, because our customers are counting on us, our clients, they're counting on us to help solve their issues. So what's not our fault is still our problem. So if we can't do something, offer what we can do. Don't just shut it down and don't say, oh, that's your boundary. Like, you got to go figure that out. There's definitely ways of communicating where it's not off-putting like that.
Yeah. Well, and you've even alluded to some things that you can practically do there. We'll dive a little deeper on that implementation, but I'll come to you, Bill, for a minute here. But so how do we know, or how does somebody know that like you said, they've crossed the line or not? So how do you establish it? What are the boundaries? What are the what are the ways that you can help communicate that here is a boundary to an individual in your organization or in your life?
Right. Well, you do need to use some tact and decorum, as Charlie alluded to. You can't just necessarily drop it on somebody's lap of, hey, get out of my space, kind of a thing. I mean, sometimes it comes down to that. Sometimes there's no other choice. But if you can establish those boundaries up front before they become an issue that you have to just be flat out and tactless with. Setting it up in the employee handbook for the major stuff. Doing things like blocking out your calendar. I have my calendar set up to automatically put in blocks of time around other appointments, and so that there's always time to recover from a call or an appointment with someone. It'll always put another 15 minutes after the appointment. So if it goes from 3 to 3:30, my calendar's blocked out till 3:45, and that helps take care of any overages from the appointment, and also gives me a few minutes to recover from whatever it was I just did. But yeah, blocking out the calendar for special events. Things that you gotta go to the soccer game, to your kid's soccer game, so you put that in the calendar. But yeah, and then as far as non-time related boundaries, you really just have to make sure people know about these. Have a as part of a team meeting where all people can talk about their personal boundaries in space, and can discuss how company function can work around those boundaries, or if those boundaries happen to be unreasonable or untenable for whatever reason, then you have an opportunity to discuss those in the group and figure out a solution.
Yeah. I'll come to you, Curtis, in a moment here, because I think you brought up a good point, Bill, because my boundary may conflict with a different boundary, may have overlapping boundaries or some things like that. So I think it's important when you effectively communicate that you're not doing it in isolation and just saying like, well, this is my boundary. And you're like, well, there's a gap here. So now what do we do? This is, my responsibilities end here, and then there's somebody else's. So that's where my boundary is. And so you have to, I think it's important that you effectively communicate these. I almost think of them as a law, or if you don't, maybe not so much as a law, but if you pass a law or you pass something and nobody knows about it, how do you, and you're guilty of it, how do you know? It's like, I didn't even know I was guilty of violating the said law or boundaries. So Doxy, what's advice that you can give to leaders in communicating this to the team, whether it's in a group or one-on-one, whether it's in writing? What's your advice and guidance there?
Right. I'll tell you what I use, and it's extremely effective, is because of course you're talking boundaries, you're talking really systems that need to be in place. But what I tell them is that look at the United States of America. We have such a split. We have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have independent, whatever. But written in there is the best system or boundaries or document that allows this country to grow. And what is it? It's the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And the Constitution has amendments. And what that really means, what I try to bring to the table in developing a culture, or at least these boundaries you speak of, is that you have to have a system in place or systems in place of a company that will allow your people to not only grow, but to understand these boundaries, or even the laws that you even mentioned, David, mm-hmm. that will impact the company in a negative way. You want it to be in the positive way. And, mm-hmm. and I'll tell you, I use that as an example because you have Republicans, you have Democrats, you have, I don't know why, you of course don't want politics in the business, but when you throw the Constitution out there, they then begin to understand, if they've read the Constitution, they understand what I'm talking about when you develop these systems or boundaries, if you will, as Bill and Charlie mentioned. Then they understand, oh, I kind of get it because I'm a Republican, but you're a Democrat. I get it. Okay. Usually that's the approach I take, and it's actually helped build companies' culture for sure.
I think that's a great observation. I guess you triggered in me, Doxy, as you're talking about that. In constitutions, they don't have to be long, but
No.
it doesn't have to be long and drawn out. I would say in there are stated. Also, I would say look at your values. Hopefully, you guys have stated values, right? And we've talked about mission and vision and company culture too, right? So these should all be in alignment, right? And we've talked about previous episodes there about company culture.
Yeah, and the idea is amendment. So you can, as your company grows, you may have to have an amendment to what you have, and that's really, I mean, heck, prohibition back in the day, you couldn't drink alcohol, but it was an amendment. So I mean, that's the beauty of a document, a constitution, and of course a company's constitution, that you're allowing yourselves to grow and make amendments to those boundaries, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point. And we're going to get into implementing boundaries here. Or we've got another guest jumping in. Heather with us has been on a couple past episodes, so we'll let her get settled in here. But boundaries obviously can shift too, right? They're not rigid.
Yeah.
And so as we shift, like you said, that's a great analogy, Doxy, of amendments. It was started one way, and now we've adjusted based on certain values and understanding about how we're going to show up as an organization. So that's a great lead into where Bill and Charlie have already hit on a little bit, and I want to go a little deeper in this, is how do we implement boundaries? What are the practical steps that we can do? And you guys mentioned some of them, the time-bound ones. But recognizing, like, again, I like the idea of laws. Okay, we have laws. Then how do you actually implement a law, right? It's one thing to write a law. It's one thing to say, here's the boundary. It's another thing to actually implement it and make sure it's successful. So maybe I'll start with you, Charlie, to think about this. You mentioned, again, some of these things. But what are some other thoughts here on practical implementation, especially after Doxy has shared some insights there?
Yeah, I like the Constitution analogy, because that's how you dictate. Well, I don't like to use the word dictate, right? But like that's how you that's how you that's how you get everyone on the same page, right? With actually having a document that's not just sitting somewhere in the ether, or a lofty quote that's up on your wall that nobody lives by. We actually, so internally, what we've done is we created a document called the Intellisys Way, and it starts out with our mission and our action statement. So our mission is to influence those we touch so that they can reach their goals. And our action statement is always deliver well. And so these are things that we're touching on every day, twice a day in our daily huddles. And we go over what does wow feel like. We have it defined. We have our never and always list. So that's almost like our boundary right there. We will never do these things or say these things, and we will always do or say these things instead. So that way we have a brand promise that we can count on, that we know, like that guideline of how we want to show up, where we want to come from in every interaction, as opposed to leaving it up to chance.
How about you, Bill? Thoughts here on implementation?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. I do really like Doxy's analogy of using the Constitution, because it brings up something that we might not have thought of, and that's unintended consequences of writing these things down. The U.S. Constitution was written to make the the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate to be the most powerful branch. That's why it's so detailed. And the president was supposed to be the least powerful. That's why it's the least detailed. However, the unintended consequence was that it has effectively become just the opposite. Because there's not a lot of definition to the role of president. The president then became commander in chief of the military. Was able, Thomas Jefferson was able to double the size of the country with the purchase of Louisiana, and a whole bunch of other things. And Congress had its hands tied because there were definitions for these things. And so you have to realize that when you write, you have to be careful when you write down your boundaries, your all of your values and whatnot, because there can be unintended consequences. You might be writing yourself into a corner. So be careful when you are writing those things down and think about what could be, not just what you want to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great observation, Bill. And having worked with different organizations, I've worked with nonprofits, I've worked with for-profits, and to that point, there's these written unintended consequences or boundaries or limitations that, and so understanding that, I guess the question I have for Bill and for all of you guys is that, okay, how can we be more intentional in there, or get people to talk about these things, recognize these limitations or changes, and then say, okay, what do we need to do to get consensus? Now, if some of them may be easier, other ones that might be a little harder to make and to change those things. Even if you can change it, you can write it down, change, but people's hearts and minds are fixed on certain ways. And you're like, hey, are we actually agreeing to move on this? Bill, what's been your experience there?
Well, one of the controls you can have over the unintended consequences, the misinterpretations, is by consulting with the group. Sometimes groupthink is really bad, but getting distinct opinions and guidance from the individuals in the group can be a great help. And you can also use outside documentation to see how other organizations have dealt with this. You can also ask people like the crew here.
Yes.
Reach out to us and say what's the possibilities of this. Is this a good thing or not? And
Absolutely. Doxy, I want to come to you too, because one of the episodes that we did not too long ago, we talked about the roles and transitions in the company and things like that. And so, I know you deal with this a lot, Doxy, in your E4 process of it, and how do we help people, again, especially when they're stepping into new roles, understand where are their boundaries, where do they need to stay within their confines of their role or responsibility, and not stepping into somebody else's and vice versa. How are ways we can again properly implement these boundaries?
Well, it's interesting when we're talking about boundaries, and I really don't know how many boundaries that there are. And by the way, each company, the boundaries are different. One boundary might have, one company might have the boundary of physical boundaries more. It impacts them more so than maybe emotional boundaries or whatever. This is why when I get into companies and we start talking about their culture and even boundaries, what we go to are systems, and I always harp on systems because systems will help with the boundaries.
Yep.
Once you understand how the system works, especially when it comes to something that's financial or material. For example, employees that want to move up into the company, from one level to the next.
Yep.
If you understand the system on how that works, then you really don't. Well, it's not that you don't meet the boundary, but at least you understand how that works. So that's why I always, when I work with companies, we talk about systems and how the systems play out, which is connected really to the boundaries that you're talking about. But again, as I said earlier, or seconds ago, is how many boundaries are there? I don't know. There's a variety of them, and some for companies are larger than others as far as impact. So it's a great question. I mean, the boundaries, what we're talking about is great, and I think Bill mentioned it. Is that people that are listening to this call, reach out to us, because
Yes.
I guarantee you, we've been down that path of dealing with different companies. We've worked with different companies. We've helped different companies and helped them grow. And really, that's what you want to do is how do you take a company and how do you grow the company? Because that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants success, or they want to feel important within the company, and how do you do that? I think that's a good question.
Yeah, well, and yeah, absolutely, and that's why we're having this podcast too, because as those that are listening, that if you're having dysfunction because you feel people are boundaries are being violated, they're not feeling appreciated, they're feeling disconnected, you're not going to grow your company. Absolutely, Doc. So and we're trying to help you untangle that, and so yes, like reach out to Bill, Doc C, Charlie, any one of us would happily discuss this with you. And I want to touch on your idea of systems, Doc C. I'll give you an example that I had in my career where I went from the private sector to the public sector. And one that I didn't realize, there was a way that we reviewed, for example, resumes and people that would come into the private company. It was just a completely different system and process than the public sector and how candidates were reviewed. I didn't know that when I came in. And so I violated the understanding how we're communicating and where to look at that. And, it was a shock to my system because the way I was doing it in the previous company was totally fine. It was just the way we looked at it, the way we discussed it, the way we processed it. It was very different in the public sector. Now, it wasn't completely clear to me until somebody came and told me, like, oh, well, we don't do it that way. I'm like, okay, I didn't understand. I didn't know. So it wasn't because they weren't mad at me per se, but they just helped me understand that, this is not the way, we do that. We got Heather back with us. So Heather, we're glad you made it.
Hi, Heather. Real quick, David, what I also wanted to just kind of piggyback and add what you're saying is that, our boundaries are changing. Boundaries of 1980 are different than there are now. I mean, they're going to continue to change with technology and intelligence. I mean, it's fascinating what I've seen the past 30 years, how companies have grown and the boundaries issue, how they come up. And that's why the system, and probably Charlie likes this too, because he's a tech guy, but I think that because of technology systems, everybody starts to understand what that really means. And it's AI and it's all those things, but it's really fascinating. I just love how things are changing rapidly as we speak.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to come to Charlie and I'm going to come to Heather because I think that's a great point. Charlie, because I want to get Heather's input on implementing as well. But Charlie, just to the point of systems, because you're very system like cybersecurity and these things, and very clearly if a boundary or a system is crossed, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So our next, we're going to talk about violating and boundaries, but just talk about this idea of systems and how Curtis has presented that.
Yeah, when I hear the word system, to us it's synonymous with process, and so and one of my idols in business is Marcus Lemonis from the show on CNBC, The Prophet, right? So he always talks about people, process, and product. Oftentimes we do I guess we put a lot of time to find the right people and make sure they're in the right seat on the bus. We have a good product, a good solution for the marketplace that the market demands. But then there's breakdowns in processes, and so that's what I hear when Doc C says system. I want to take it one step further. That ties all three of those together: the people, process, and product is culture. Um, at the end of the day, no matter what type of business we're in, whether it's business to business, business to consumer, it's human to human. So a lot of the breakdowns and violation of boundaries is because we as human beings, we all operate slightly differently in terms of our natural tendencies. And so we actually, as part of our onboarding, is we have each of our staff members take a 144 question. It's called a exam. It's a personality test. It's by the Enneagram Institute, and so there's 9 different personality types. And so by having some insight on how they tend to react or respond to different situations, it gives us a better idea of how to effectively communicate with somebody and what are some hot buttons or red flags for certain personality types that that they wound up being. And so that way we can demonstrate more compassion and empathy when dealing with the different personality types, because what may be completely like commonplace between me and you, David, but if somebody else is a different personality type, they're going to take offense to that. So we need to have that awareness to begin with, and have that culture of having the interest in the differences in people and learning about it and being empathetic to that. So that way we can put our best foot forward and being respectful of how somebody tends to operate.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to be a good lead in here into our topic of how we handle boundary violations and communicating that. But Heather, welcome. We've got Heather back. She's been on our podcast a couple different times, and thanks for joining in, Heather. But in your experience, Heather, how have you seen successful implementation of healthy boundaries, particularly in the workplace, but it could be outside of that, so that we're all winning together, hopefully.
Right. And I think that it's beautiful that we're talking about this. Thank you, David. I first of all, Charlie, Mr. Chen, I love what you talked about with understanding the personalities and how we perceive things. I too am part of a program called Powernality, and we've got 8 personality types. At any rate, I am, as you know, David, I'm one of those people, I hate rules. I hate boundaries. I hate restrictions. I hate being told what to do. I mean, if, I'm a fly by your seat kind of girl. And the reality is we have those people in our businesses, don't we? The challenge for people like me is that you have to respect and honor that those boundaries are necessary and that those healthy boundaries will keep the ship moving along fairly smoothly. When you don't set clear boundaries and people are uncertain of where they stand and what they're doing and how things are supposed to be, they cannot effectively do their jobs, right? And that is probably one of the biggest failures I've had in the different businesses that I've had. Don't get me wrong, I had I call it a modicum of success in business, probably slightly higher than that. Just because, I do have a brain and I understand that my temperament isn't necessarily always conducive to what the situation needs. And so I think it's important when we're talking about boundaries and understanding the boundaries and implementing them is that clear communication is essential. 100%. And if,
Yep.
like me, you're a leader who tends to fly by the seat of her pants, it's really important to take the time ahead of time and make sure you're prepared and know what it is that you really want, what the goal is, what the target is, where you're all working towards, because you're the team leader. And if you don't set those boundaries and give them the expectations, how could they possibly honor that and or achieve those things, right? Because it is our job to create a successful possibility, right? So we want all of our employees to have great success just as much as we have success. I've talked before about a win-win-win situation, right? You win, I win, and together we all win. Without those boundaries, you absolutely have to do it. And so for me, the key to implementing those boundaries, having the time meeting with the people as a group, and I even recommend individually, especially understanding that each person is their own person, their own key person. What makes them tick may not be what makes the group tick. Whatever you as a leader is of the group, that's going to be the leadership style. But you've got to tap into who and what they are, where they tick, what they're going to excel at. And that clear communication is the only way. And that is the only way to implement boundaries. And I think that boundaries fall in line with the expectations, the guidelines, the direction that we're going, and all of that. And I know I've jumped in late. So go ahead and stop there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so and that's great. And I want to get a little bit more into that, Heather, because the kind of the last topic here, as we're, and I want to cover this evening on our podcast is really, we've talked about effectively communicating them. How do we implement them a bit here? And then, what happens ultimately is going to happen. There's going to be a violation. There's somebody's going to cross the line. Okay. And I'm going to come to you, Bill.
Right?
Yeah. Consequences. How do we deal with that? So, Bill, this is a tough one, but how do we deal with this in a thoughtful way? And just to what Heather and Charlie talked a little bit about, knowing yourself and how you might be different in communicating with another person. So, Bill, what's been your experience with this?
My recent experience with this is with my roundtable show, Not Quite After Midnight. And I had 3 no-shows in as many weeks of broadcasts. I do 1 a week, so this was 3 for 3. And it was really frustrating. I mean, it didn't ruin the show because I still had a second guest who came on the show, but I realized after 3 weeks of this that I needed to do something. Now I had asked everyone who signed up to be professionals and keep their appointments, and assuming that would be enough. And of course, we know what happens when you assume. And so what I did was and to say something that I haven't said, that I didn't say to the group, to the people who were signed up for the show, this was all related to one person, one agent and her clients, so I got my email list out, and I constructed an email saying this is what's happened. I did not call out anybody. I did not say this was the result of one person or 3 people or anything like that. I just said there were 3 no-shows for 3 shows, and this has to stop. I said, I'm sorry to do this, but here's the new policy. Because while I did say, hey, this is the boundary, I didn't say this is the policy, these are the consequences. And now there is a policy. This is what happens. If you don't follow the policy, you'll get canceled. And you run the risk of me taking you off the email list and not being able to be welcome on the show anymore. I got a lot of responses, a lot of supportive responses, and all to it, and certainly several understanding ones. if not supportive, that, hey, understand that you got to do what you got to do. But I made a reasonable policy. I told them this is when it's going to go into effect. I said 3 shows from now was plenty of time for people to get used to this new policy. I'll probably send out another email in a couple weeks to remind them, hey, remember, this is going to go into effect on this date. It's so far so good. It seems to be working out. One of the people actually responded, "Oh, by the way, one of my clients isn't going to be able to make it on such and such date. Can you reschedule him?" And so I'm like, "Well, this is how rescheduling works. I'll go ahead and cancel him. It's okay. It's in plenty of time. I'm not upset." And I put out an announcement, hey, there's an open date, and within like 2 minutes, somebody had signed up to fill the date. But it's because I had like 2 weeks until this person's date. There was plenty of time to take care of the issue, and so really that's a very fresh example of what happened and how I've taken care of it.
That's great, Bill. And what I heard, and I want to come to you, Doc C, but I heard you addressed it. You had a process that you outlined of how this is going to go forward. So you really were clear on, what your expectations were. I heard you got buy-in as well from everybody, understanding what you're saying. So so it was a two-way communication that you sent it out. You got confirmation back. So to me, it sounds like that was effective, and you're starting to see the positive response coming from that.
Yep.
Yeah. Doc C, thoughts on this concept of boundary violations and how to handle them.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of what Bill was even talking about. I mean, even for companies, you set boundaries, expectations, and you monitor them. And of course, you're going to have to amend them. You're going to have to change them. But ultimately, you give your people a chance to learn and grow. If you do that, I think your company grows. I really do. We're all going to make mistakes. We're emotional beings, and sometimes we don't like certain rules and certain things that are expectations. And I'm addressing the young lady that's really laughing because that's really, that's it. And it's personalities and it's all of these things. But I think that Bill hit it. You set the boundaries, you set the expectations, and then you monitor. And then after that happens, if something happens, you change. But ultimately, you try to develop a culture, as Charlie mentioned, a culture in which each individual can grow, learn, and grow. I mean, that would be my 10 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. So Heather, you're chuckling in there a little bit, and you should.
Sorry about the lighting. Oh my goodness.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Hey, we got Curtis in the light earlier. Time of year, he was like in the witness protection program in earlier episodes.
Oh, but by the way, I fixed that because now I finally got my drapes that come down. So
it looks great.
I finally got those in. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it looks good. We can see you. We're not getting blocked out. So Heather, how about this? How do you handle?
Part of me is in the light and part of me is in the dark, so you better pray for me. No.
Yeah, well, that's all of us, right? But Heather, how do you what's healthy? How do we show this up healthy? Bill gave us an example, but from your perspective, from your experience, when you have a violation of a boundary, and I think there's different kinds. There's kinds that were unintentional, like I mentioned earlier, where I didn't realize, and there's the people that are willfully, and those are two different discussions. So I'll let you pick which one you want to go on, Heather. But there's those that are people that willfully are going to violate it, and like, I don't care about your boundary, I'm going to violate it. And there's those people that are, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Let me back up and understand where the boundary is. So Heather, either one of those, where do you what's your take there?
I have to say, I really resonate with what Doc C said. And, I guess it looks like Dr. C. Is Doc C okay with you?
Oh,
You're all going to get a nickname. Just accept it. Unless it's a boundary, and I need to know that. The reality is rules are important. We do need them. It doesn't matter how much you love them or dislike them. Rules are a necessity. Like you said, we are fallible. We are humans. We are emotional beings. It's possible for us to just totally miss the mark or blow it. We all have done that, right? And I like the fact that you talk about that needs to be a learning moment, right? I think too, especially when you're talking about someone who's a little more challenging, possibly deliberately pushing those boundaries, deliberately crossing the line, while there does indeed need to be consequences, I think it's still all a learning opportunity. And with that, I mean, understanding that some people are just not made that way, but if they're going to fit in and get the job done and be rewarded for doing the job well done, they need to understand these guidelines and they need to fall within them. So I think when it comes to consequences, for me, they tend to be varying. So I see either way as a learning opportunity. Now, of course, you can come to a point of impasse with you have someone who's just literally not going to do what you want them to do. Well, as a business owner, I can't afford to pay you and not do your job, especially as a small business owner, because I need to have time to work on the business. I can't spend all my time working in the business. Okay. So that's the reason that these boundaries, these guidelines are in place. There are certain things that are okay. There are certain things that are always in the gray area, right? But the bottom line, there are also some things that just absolutely cross the line and they will not be tolerated. Whether or not you take that as a learning spot or not, it still needs to be explained that this will not be tolerated. I don't do a 1, 2, 3 strike, you're out. Now you need to understand this is where you're at. You need to decide do you want to be part of the team or not. That's it. And I hate doing that. My personality doesn't like that. I want everyone to love me. Okay. But that just isn't realistic if you're going to be a good, solid business owner, business manager, owning your direction that you want in life, right? That's just the way it's got to be. I'll stop there, David.
Yeah, no, it's so important. And in fact, I think this is probably a good stopping point because we're gonna come back. There's a whole another deeper episode here, just on how do we deal with the violations of these boundaries and rules and dealing with consequences and things like that. But really great input there, Heather. As we're kind of thinking about these things in boundaries and why we have them, how to effectively communicate them, those expectations, how do we effectively implement them, as we've talked about this episode. I'll come back to you, Bill, for kind of just final thoughts, and we'll come back around here for this as we wrap up this episode. But Bill, just kind of final thoughts or takeaways that we've discussed today.
Well, I think what I've learned with my recent experience is that there needs to be a policy and a consequence to go along with those boundaries. Just having the boundary is like having, well, not to get into politics, but having a U.S.-Mexico border without any supervision on it. Anybody will walk over it who wants to, and if you don't have a consequence and a policy to enforce that boundary, then you're just going to get walked all over too.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Glad having you here. Charlie, final thoughts as we're wrapping it up here.
Yeah, I think final thoughts when it comes to boundaries, you want to separate it or take the morality out of it. There's no, good or bad, right and wrong when it comes to boundaries. It's just we're all different. We're all wired differently. And the goal is not perfection, it's progress, right? So just having the courage to be imperfect, that is going to allow you to navigate it. Because like Doc C said, we're all human. We're prone to our emotions. And so we're not going to always get it right. It's not about getting it right. It's about just having the courage to continue to progress. And at the end of the day, we're going to have difficult people that we're going to deal with, whether it be internal or external. So it's just making sure that we just focus on what we can control. So that's the boundary as well that we set internally, that we can't control what other people think, what they say, how they react, and or things outside like the economy or the politics, policymakers. We just focus on what we have control over, period. And so that's the boundary that we set for ourselves, and stop obsessing over things that we have no influence over.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie, for sharing that. Appreciate your input tonight. Doc C, final thoughts as we're wrapping up the episode.
Yeah, I love that, Charlie. I like that. It's interesting, these boundaries. These boundaries really have kind of helped me, speaking personally, think outside of my own box. When my boundaries are pushed, so to speak, because of the way I'm thinking, ever since I was a kid, I can remember that I see these other boundaries issues pop up, and it makes me actually, well, wait a minute, before I say that that's not a good thing, maybe I should open up my box. So I'm not saying that all boundary issues are negative, because they can actually help you yourself grow.
Yes.
So I think that you just kind of like what Charlie mentioned just now, is that these things help us expand ourselves. And so I think that it's a good thing sometimes.
Yeah. I really liked your analogy tonight about the Constitution and amendments and being able to, we can adjust boundaries. We can pull them in, we can expand them out, we can adjust the line. So I think that's a good thing. And I really like that perspective, Doxy, of like, hey, let me just evaluate, is this good and healthy? Is this getting me where I want to be? Maybe or maybe not. And I really appreciate that. Absolutely. Heather, as we're wrapping up, last thoughts here.
All right. I love what everybody said. I'm just not going to try to reiterate it because I know we're closing up here, but I think I'm going to kind of end on that note of boundaries aren't necessarily good or bad. They just are, right? When you work within the boundaries, there's so much success that can come with it, right? So boundaries aren't necessarily about what you can't do, as you mentioned, Doxy. Boundaries are about understanding and applying those things, again, which you can control. They are. And understanding who's working for us. So, you have a little bit of insight as to who I am. Can you imagine having been my employer in the early days? Because I tend to believe that boundaries were made to be pushed. That's just kind of who I am. When we were, I spent some time in Finland. I spent 3 months in Finland, and I was very young. I was 18. I graduated high school. I went to Finland. I took a tour up to Lapland, and on that tour, we came right up against the Russian border. Now, understand, we're talking months ago. It was still communist Russia, okay? And we were warned, do not even put a finger over that fence line because people have been shot for that. Okay, now that is a dire consequence for someone who's pushing a boundary, right? Now, I'm not going to lie, it spoke to me. I got really long and hard several times about trying it, but the reality is that boundary and that expectation was put in place to keep me alive, literally alive, right? So maybe our boundaries within the workplace that we're talking about are not so dire, but there is a reason for them, and they should be a productive reason. I'm going to
Mhm.
end on that. So
Yes,
there you go.
absolutely. No, and if you need help, and if you're feeling stuck or you're struggling with boundaries, or you're like these are not right or they're off, or we just need to even tweak them a little bit, contact Heather, Charlie, Doxy, myself. Leave a comment in here. We do follow up on the comments. We make sure that this podcast is available in multiple forms. So whether you're listening to it, watching it on YouTube, checking us out on LinkedIn, we would love to connect with you guys and hear from you. We actually there's other future guests coming on here as well. So we like to have other voices. So we're glad to have Heather back. We've got Charlie returning and Doc C. And so if there's something you guys are listening to or you haven't heard and you're like, I'd really like you guys to cover this topic, please let us know. I just want to say thank you, Charlie and Doc C, Heather, for coming back and engaging in this really thoughtful conversation. Bill had to jump off as well. So we're grateful for Bill. And just thank you guys, and we'll be back again soon. So until then, have an amazing night. Thanks, everybody.
David.
All right, bye-bye.
Great meeting you, Heather. Miss
Ciao,
Healer.
ciao. Mwah.
All right. Bye.